Viral truth Unwitting, fiction story by Elrond. The world had changed overnight. It began as a whisper, a murmur that drifted through the corridors of power and filtered down into the everyday lives of the unsuspecting. People went about their routines, oblivious to the quiet terror lurking beneath the surface, woven into the very fabric of their existence. But Dr. James Lee was not oblivious. He had seen the signs, had felt the tremors of an impending storm long before others even caught a whiff of it. For Dr. Lee, the revelations arrived like an uninvited guest, one that seized him by the throat and refused to let go. It was in the sterile, fluorescent glow of the hospital that he first encountered the dark truth. Patient files, stacked high on his desk, were marked with discrete red symbols that signified something far more sinister than mere illness. Behind closed doors, decisions were being made. Decisions that would determine who lived and who died. And as he scanned the ever-growing list of names, Dr. Lee felt the weight of each one settle heavily on his conscience. The hospital, once a sanctuary of healing, had transformed into a place of dread. The echo of hurried footsteps in the hallways, the furtive glances of nurses, the tight-lipped murmurs between doctors, all signs that they too felt the grip of fear tightening around them. He knew he could not trust anyone, not even the walls that seemed to listen and observe with an unsettling silence. Shadows moved where there should be none, and every creak of the floorboards felt like a warning. Yet, the hardest part was knowing that he was not just a passive observer. His hands were tied, but his mind raced, desperately seeking a way to unravel the conspiracy that had taken hold of his life. And then, as if to mock his isolation, David arrived. His brother-in-law, a man who bore his own scars, both visible and hidden. The shared understanding between them ran deep, forged by loss and hardship. But even that bond would be tested as they delved into a world of secrets, betrayal, and unimaginable danger. As Dr. Lee prepared to confront the darkness that threatened to consume everything he held dear, he knew one thing for certain. This was not just a battle for survival, but a battle for the truth. A truth that, once uncovered, could either save them all or destroy them. But at this point, he was willing to risk everything. Chapter 1. The Order. Dr. James Lee wiped the sweat from his brow as he stared at the email on his computer screen. His heart pounded against his ribcage as the words blurred before him. Dr. Lee was known as the gentle giant in the hospital, with his large build and dark features. The order had come directly from the top, anonymously signed, yet everyone in the hospital knew who it was from. The cabal of unseen powers who controlled every decision in the country. The same faceless group who had unleashed the virus in the first place. The email sent was, "Effective immediately. All patients testing positive for virus Z9 are to be eliminated. This is a matter of national security. Do not inform the families." Dr. Lee's hands trembled as he reread the directive. Eliminated, they had said, as if these patients were not human beings, but just statistics to be erased. This was against everything he believed in, everything he had sworn to protect as a doctor. He knew they had already begun enforcing these orders in other hospitals across the country, but now it had reached his ward. "James!" a voice called from behind him, breaking his trance. He turned to see Dr. Emma Peters, his colleague and friend, standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you see the email?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I did," Dr. Lee James replied, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "They're asking us to murder our patients. Emma, this is madness." Dr. Emma stepped closer, her voice rising. "They're not asking, James. They're ordering. We don't have a choice." "We always have a choice," Dr. Lee shot back, his eyes blazing with defiance. "I won't do it. I refuse." A heavy silence filled the room as Dr. Emma looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and dread. "You know what happens to those who refuse," she said, her voice trembling. "You'll disappear like the others." Before Dr. Lee could respond, a sudden commotion erupted from the direction of the reception area. Shouts echoed down the corridor, growing louder with each passing second. "What the hell is going on now?" Dr. Lee muttered, rushing out of his office with Dr. Emma close behind him. As they neared the reception, the shouting became clearer. "Let me see my wife! I know she's here!" A man's voice, hoarse with desperation, echoed through the hall. Dr. Lee rounded the corner just in time to see a man in his late 30s, wild-eyed and dishevelled, brandishing a handgun. "Mr. Blake, please calm down. A nurse pleaded from behind the counter, her hand raised in a placating gesture. "We can't let you see her right now. It's—" "Don't lie to me!" The man, whom Dr. Lee recognized as John Blake, one of the patient's husbands, roared. "I know what you're doing. She called me. She said they were taking her to the isolation ward, and now she's gone. Where is she? What have you done with her?" Dr. Lee felt a cold chill run down his spine. The isolation ward. Blake's wife had tested positive just that morning. "John, please," Dr. Lee called out, stepping forward cautiously, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. "Put down the gun and we can talk about this." Blake's eyes flicked to Dr. Lee, recognition sparking in them. "Dr. Lee, you treated her. You must know where she is. Please, tell me she's okay." "John, Dr. Lee hesitated, knowing that whatever he said would likely only make things worse. "I don't know where she is right now, but I promise you we can find out together. Just put down the gun." For a moment it seemed like Blake might comply. His grip on the weapon loosened slightly, his eyes filling with tears. "She is all I have, Doctor. Please, don't take her from me." Before Dr. Lee could say another word, the situation exploded. A loud bang echoed through the room, and Dr. Lee flinched as he saw a police officer at the entrance, gun drawn, having just fired. Blake stumbled backward, a look of shock on his face as he crumpled to the floor, blood spreading across his chest. "No!" Dr. Lee shouted, rushing to Blake's side, but it was too late. The man was gone, his eyes staring sightless at the ceiling. Dr. Emma screamed, covering her mouth as she backed away, horrified. The reception area erupted into chaos, nurses and patients shouting and fleeing in all directions. Dr. Lee knelt by Blake's side, feeling utterly helpless. This was wrong. All of it. They were supposed to be saving lives, not taking them. The police officer holstered his weapon and turned to Dr. Lee, his expression hard. "He was a threat, Doctor. We couldn't risk him hurting anyone else." Dr. Lee looked up at the officer, anger boiling in his chest. "He wasn't a threat. He was a desperate man trying to find his wife." The officer didn't flinch. "Desperate men with guns are dangerous. I did what I had to do." As the officer turned away, Dr. Lee felt the weight of the entire situation crushing down on him. This was what the world had come to, people killing each other in a panic, all because of the machinations of those hidden in the shadows, pulling the strings. He couldn't be a part of this anymore. He wouldn't. Dr. Lee stood up, his decision made. He would find out who was behind all of this, and he would stop them, no matter the cost. He glanced back at Blake's body one last time, a silent promise forming in his mind. They had taken everything from Blake, from all of them, but he wouldn't let them win. He couldn't. As he walked away from the chaos of the reception area, Dr. Lee felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. The world had gone mad, but he hadn't lost his humanity. And that was something no one could take from him. Not even them. Chapter 2. The Cost of Obedience. Dr. James Lee sat in the dim light of his office, surrounded by patient files stacked so high they seemed to reach the ceiling. The smell of antiseptic clung to the air, a constant reminder of the sterile, lifeless environment the hospital had become. The screen of his computer still displayed the latest list of those to be eliminated, a list that had grown exponentially in the past few days. His eyes, bloodshot from lack of sleep, blurred as he scanned the names. His heart pounded with a mix of exhaustion and dread. 3 of his staff were already gone, 3 brilliant, compassionate doctors who had refused to send patients to the elimination rooms, believing they could save them instead. They had paid the price for their defiance. Dr. Lee could still see their faces, hear their voices echoing in his mind, begging for more time, for a chance to find a cure. But time was a luxury they no longer had. The patients came in faster than they could handle, many already too weak to fight the virus, some clinging to life with desperation, their eyes pleading for mercy. It was unbearable, the weight of their suffering crushing him, yet he continued to follow the orders, knowing that any hesitation would result in the same fate as his colleagues. But today was different. A loud bang at the door snapped him out of his daze. Before he could respond, the door slammed open, and David, his brother-in-law, stepped into the room. His face was a mask of anger and fear, his brown eyes boring into Dr. Lee's with an intensity that made his heart skip a beat. David's looks handsome, with a square chin line, who trained 3 hours a day, he carried a scar across his sharp nose. His short hair showed the scars of stitches across his skull on the left side. He had seen a rough time at war, no doubt. "James," David said, his voice loud and dangerous, "we need to talk." Dr. Lee swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. He already knew what David was going to say, but hearing it out loud would make it real, too real. "David, "Save it!" David interrupted, slamming the door behind him. He took a step closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "I know about Alex." Dr. Lee's heart stopped. The name, his son's name, hung in the air like a noose around his neck. "He's just a boy, James," David continued, his voice rising with every word. "He's your son. How could you even consider—" "David, I don't have a choice," Dr. Lee said, his voice cracking as he tried to maintain some semblance of control. "If I don't do it, they will. And they'll kill me too. And then who will be here to protect him? Who will—" "Protect him!" David spat, his face twisted in fury. "You call what you're doing protection? You're going to kill him. You're going to kill your own flesh and blood because some faceless monsters behind a screen told you to. Is that who you've become?" "I don't want to do this," Dr. Lee shouted back, the desperation in his voice unmistakable. "Do you think I want to kill my son? Do you think I haven't thought of every possible way out of this? But there is no way out, David. If I defy them, we're all dead. You, me, Alex, everyone." David stared at him, his chest heaving with anger. "You're wrong, James. There is a way out. I've heard things, rumours, whispers of people who've survived, who've come back from the infection. They don't want us to know, but it's true. There's a chance. We just have to find it." Dr. Lee shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "Rumours, David. That's all they are. Rumours. I can't bet my son's life on a rumour." David's face darkened, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "If you go through with this, if you kill Alex without giving him a chance, I swear I will kill you, James. I swear to God I will end you myself." Dr. Lee froze, the words hitting him like a physical blow. David wasn't bluffing. He could see it in his eyes, the cold, hard resolve. His brother-in-law was deadly serious. "David, please," Dr. Lee begged, his voice trembling. "Don't make me choose between my son and my life. I don't know what to do. I'm just trying to survive." David's expression softened for a moment, a flicker of sympathy crossing his face. "You don't have to choose, James. We can fight this. We can save Alex. But you have to make the right choice now, before it's too late." Silence hung between them, heavy and oppressive. Dr. Lee's mind raced, torn between his duty and his love for his son. The thought of Alex's bright eyes, his infectious laughter, his unwavering trust in his father, all of it came rushing back, stabbing at Dr. Lee's heart with unbearable pain. Finally, Dr. Lee nodded, his decision made, though the words felt like they were tearing his soul apart as they left his mouth. "I won't do it, David. I'll find a way to save him. But if I fail—" David cut him off, stepping forward to grip Dr. Lee's shoulder with a fierce intensity. "You won't fail. We won't let you fail. But if anything happens to Alex because of you, I will hold you accountable. Do you understand?" Dr. Lee nodded again, his throat too tight to speak. David released his grip, his expression unreadable as he turned to leave the room. "Get him out of here, James," David said over his shoulder, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "Get him somewhere safe. I'll do what I can to help, but we don't have much time." And then he was gone, leaving Dr. Lee alone in the darkness of his office, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like never before. The sound of the door closing echoed in his mind, a stark reminder of the impossible choice he faced. Dr. Lee knew what he had to do. He had to save his son, no matter the cost. Even if it meant going against everything he had ever known, everything he had ever believed in. He had defied the orders from above once, and now he would do it again. This time, though, the stakes were higher, the risks greater. But it didn't matter. Alex was all that mattered now. And as Dr. Lee prepared to leave the hospital, his heart heavy with fear and determination, he knew that the real battle was just beginning. A battle not just for his son's life, but for his own soul. He could only hope he was strong enough to win. Chapter 3. The Final Decision. Dr. James Lee sat beside his son's bed, his hand trembling as he brushed a lock of sweat-soaked hair from Alex's forehead. The boy's skin was pale, almost translucent under the harsh hospital lights, and his breathing was shallow and laboured. Each rise and fall of his chest seemed like a battle, every gasp a desperate plea for relief. Alex had always been so strong, so full of life. Now he was a shadow of the boy James once knew, his body ravaged by the virus. Dr. Lee's wife sat outside the perimeter of the isolation ward, her brown eyes red and swollen from endless crying, her knuckles white from the intensity of her grip around her bag's handle. Claire, a beautiful brunette who dressed with dignity and style, but today she was a mess. "James," Claire whispered, her voice breaking when she saw her husband walking through the isolation ward with his shoulders down, lost and defeated. "How is he?" Claire hoping to hear a miracle. "I can't do anything to ease his suffering," Dr. Lee replied back. "You're a doctor. You can help him, can't you? Please, just make it stop. Make it stop, James. I can't bear it anymore," Claire pleaded. Dr. Lee's heart shattered at the sound of her voice, at the sight of his son struggling to hold on. He had tried everything, every treatment, every experimental drug, every desperate measure he could think of. But nothing had worked. The virus was too powerful, too relentless, and now there was nothing left to do but watch his son slip away. "I've tried, Claire," Dr. Lee said, his voice hollow. "I've tried everything. There's nothing more I can do." "That's not true," Claire snapped, her eyes blazing with a mix of fury and despair. "You're a doctor, James. You save lives. That's what you do. You can't just give up on him." "I'm not giving up," Dr. Lee replied, though the words felt like a lie even as he said them. "But I can't keep him alive just to prolong his suffering. He's in so much pain, Claire. I don't know how much more he can take." Claire shook her head, her grip tightening on Dr. Lee's arm. "You can't do this, James. You can't just let him go. He's our son. You must fight for him." "I have fought for him," Dr. Lee shouted, the desperation and guilt pouring out of him in a torrent. "I've fought for him with everything I have, but it's not enough. Nothing I do is enough." Claire's eyes filled with fresh tears, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Please, James, don't take him from me. Not yet, I'm begging you." Dr. Lee closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words, the weight of his failure crushing him. He had sworn an oath to save lives, to protect his patients, but now that oath felt like a cruel joke. What good was it if he couldn't even save his own son? "I love you, Claire," Dr. Lee whispered, his voice trembling. "I love him more than anything in this world, but I can't let him suffer like this. I can't." Claire looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "If you do this, James, if you take him from me, I'll never forgive you. Do you hear me? Never." Dr. Lee felt the tears welling in his own eyes as he nodded, knowing that she meant every word. But he also knew that he couldn't let his son suffer any longer. He couldn't watch Alex endure this agony, this slow, torturous death. "I'm sorry, Claire," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." Without waiting for her response, Dr. Lee nodded to the guard, loosened his wife's grip from his arm, his legs unsteady beneath him. He knew what he had to do. He turned and walked back towards the isolation ward, hearing his wife's crying screams. Her sobs filled the corridors. "No, James, please don't." Dr. Lee couldn't stop. He couldn't let his son suffer any more. He walked to the medicine cabinet, his hands shaking as he retrieved the syringe and filled it with the dose that would finally bring Alex peace. He returned to his son's room, standing beside the bed, his heart breaking as he looked down at Alex, who was barely conscious, barely aware of what was happening. "I love you, buddy," Dr. Lee whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry it had to be like this." With trembling hands, he administered the injection in his IV, watching as his son's breathing slowly began to ease, the pain lines on his face softening. It was quick, painless, just like they had always promised it would be, but it felt like a betrayal, a final, unforgivable betrayal. Claire's cry echoed in his ears as he watched Alex slip away, his heart shattering into million pieces. And then there was nothing, just the empty silence of a life that had ended too soon. It was done. Alex was gone. Dr. Lee stood there numb. He couldn't bear to face Claire. He couldn't bear to see the hatred and grief in her eyes. He had done what he thought was right, but it felt horribly wrong. He had lost everything. Dr. Lee walked through the silent hospital corridors, his footsteps echoing off the walls. It was late, so late that the building felt like a ghost town, empty and desolate. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him, suffocating him, making it hard to breathe. He had just reached the parking lot when he heard footsteps behind him. He didn't turn around. He was too numb, too exhausted to care about anything anymore. Maybe it was David, coming to make good on his promise. Maybe it was a colleague or a stranger, whoever it was, it didn't matter. The footsteps quickened, and before Dr. Lee could react, he felt a sharp, burning pain in his side. He gasped, his hand instinctively going to the source of the pain, but another blow came, and another. He staggered, the world spinning around him, the pain overwhelming. He fell to his knees, the cold, hard asphalt pressing against him as his blood pooled beneath him. He looked up, just in time to see the shadowy figure in the balaclava standing over him, the knife glinting in the dim light. "You deserved this," the man hissed, his voice cold and emotionless. "You brought this on yourself." Dr. Lee's vision blurred as the darkness closed in around him. He thought of Claire, of Alex, of the tried to do the right thing, but now, at the end, he wasn't sure what that was anymore. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the man walking away, disappearing into the night. And then there was nothing. Just the empty void where everything had once been. Chapter 4. The Aftermath. The morning after Dr. James Lee's death. The hospital was in a buzz with a kind of tension that none of the staff could ignore. The rumours had started before dawn, spreading like wildfire through the corridors. By the time the police arrived, the entire hospital was in edge, the air thick with fear and suspicion. It was the cleaner who found him first. She had been doing her rounds, emptying bins and wiping down surfaces, when she noticed something odd in the parking lot. At first, she thought it was just another piece of rubbish someone had left behind, but as she drew closer, she saw the dark pool of blood, the crumpled form of a man lying face down on the cold asphalt. She screamed. The police were on the scene within minutes, sealing off the area and ushering the early morning shift into a makeshift waiting area for questioning. Officers moved swiftly, taking statements from anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. But as the hours passed, it became clear that no one had seen anything. No one had heard a thing. The parking lot was on the far side of the hospital, where the security camera was sparse and the lighting was poor. It was the perfect place for a crime like this, if anyone had planned it. As the police worked, the staff huddled together in small groups, whispering about the murder, the tension palpable. Nurses and doctors alike spoke in hushed tones, casting nervous glances at the detectives who moved among them. "It could have been any of us," one nurse said, her voice trembling. "After everything that's happened, everyone's on edge. Anyone could have snapped." Another nurse nodded in agreement. "Anyone who came in on a stretcher and left in a body bag, they probably hate us. They probably want to kill us all." But one nurse, a young woman named Karen, stayed quiet, her mind racing. She had been on duty that night, just down the hall from Dr. Lee's office. She had seen his brother-in-law David storming out, his face dark with anger, his words sharp and threatening. She hesitated, unsure whether to speak up. But as the detectives made their way toward her, she knew she couldn't keep it to herself. "Detective," Karen said, nervously as she stepped forward, "there's something you should know." The detective, a tall, gruff man with a stern expression, turned to her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Go on." Karen swallowed, gathering her courage. "Last night I overheard a conversation. Dr. James Lee's brother-in-law, David, he was furious. He said something about killing Dr. Lee if he took his son's life away." The detective's eyes sharpened, his interest piqued. "You're sure about that?" Karen nodded, though doubt gnawed at her insides. "I'm sure. I mean, I didn't see anything else, but it sounded serious." The detective scribbled in his notebook, then looked up at her. "Thank you. This could be important." Within hours, David was brought in for questioning. He was tired, dishevelled, and his eyes were bloodshot from a night of restless wandering. He had no alibi, he admitted. He had been walking downtown after leaving a pub, alone with his thoughts, trying to process the devastation of losing his nephew. But he swore over and over again that he has nothing to do with his brother-in-law's death. "I didn't kill James," David said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and frustration as he sat in the interrogation room, facing the stern gazes of the detectives. "Yes, I was angry. Of course I was angry. He killed my nephew, his own son, but I didn't kill him. I wouldn't do that." The detectives exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. "You have to understand," one of them said, leaning forward. "Your anger, your threats, they make you a prime suspect, and you have no alibi." David slammed his fist on the table, a mixture of despair and rage flooding his voice. "I didn't do it. I was walking, trying to clear my head. I didn't even go back to the hospital. I just needed to be alone." But his pleas seemed to fall on deaf ears. The detectives were relentless, probing for any sign of a lie, any crack in his story. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Claire Lee sat in a small, sterile room, her face a mask of numbness. She had been given sedatives after collapsing from the shock of losing both her son and husband in the same night. Now, she sat quietly, her hands trembling in her lap as the police questioned her about David. "Mrs. Lee," one detective said gently, "we need to ask you about your brother. Do you think he could have done this? Did he have a reason to—" But Claire cut him off, her voice flat and emotionless. "I don't care who killed him," she said, her eyes staring blankly ahead. "All I know is that he killed my son. James killed our son, and he got what he deserved." The detective exchanged a glance with his partner, uncertain how to proceed. "Mrs. Lee, we understand you're grieving, but—" "I don't care," Claire repeated, her voice emotionless. "He killed our son. Whoever did this, they did what I couldn't. They ended his suffering." The detective left her alone after that, unsure what more they could say. Outside the hospital, the investigation continued, but with each passing hour it became clear that this was not a case with easy answers. There were no witnesses, no clear evidence, and no way to prove David's innocence or guilt. As the day wore on, David sat alone in the holding cell, his mind racing. He knew he hadn't killed James, but he also knew that proving it would be next to impossible. He had no alibi, no way to show where he had been. All he had was his words, and in the eyes of the law that wasn't nearly enough. In the end, it didn't matter who had wielded the knife. What mattered was that lives had been shattered, families torn apart by the Z9 virus, by the choices made in the name of survival. And now, the truth seemed as elusive as the cure they had all been searching for. David's fate hung in the balance, and as the night fell once more, the only certainty was that nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 5. The Promise. David sat on the hard bench that served as his bed in the cold, dimly lit cell. The concrete walls felt like they were closing in on him, the air thick with the smell of dampness and despair. He had spent hours pacing the small space, replaying every moment of that fateful night in his mind, searching for something, anything, that could prove his innocence. But every time, his thoughts inevitable drifted back to Alex. He remembered the first time he held his nephew, just hours after arriving home from war. The war had left him shattered, a shell of the man he once was. But Alex had been his salvation. James was always busy, buried under the weight of his responsibilities, and Claire had been weak after the difficult birth, leaving David to step in where he could. He taught Alex everything a father should, how to take his first steps, how to tie his shoelaces, how to build a tree house in the backyard, and even how to camp out under the stars. The boy had been a lifeline, pulling David back from the brink of darkness. Now, that lifeline had been cruelly severed, and all David could think about was the life his nephew would never get to live. But even as these memories washed over him, there was something else nagging at the back of his mind, something he hadn't told the police. The meeting. David's heart raced as he recalled the secretive gathering he had attended the night Alex died. It was a meeting with a group of like-minded individuals, all of whom were determined to uncover the truth about the virus, its origin, its purpose, and the shadowy figures pulling the strings behind the scenes. They had sworn to secrecy, knowing that if their activities were discovered, they would all be in grave danger. That was why David hadn't mentioned it to the police. He couldn't. It would have put too many lives at risk. But now, as he sat in that cold cell, he couldn't help but wonder if keeping that secret was worth it. Was it worth his freedom? Was it worth his nephew's life? The questions spun around in his mind, pulling him further into a web of doubt and guilt, until, finally, exhaustion overtook him, and he drifted off into a restless sleep. A loud banging on the cell door jerked him awake. David sat up abruptly, disoriented, the harsh fluorescent lights of the police station burning his eyes. "Get up!" a gruff voice ordered. A uniformed officer stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "They want to talk to you again." David was led back to the interrogation room where the same two detectives waited. They looked as tired as he felt, their faces drawn and pale under the harsh lighting. They motioned for him to sit, and the questioning resumed, relentless and exhausting. But no matter how they phrased their questions, David's answers remained the same. "I didn't kill him," David repeated what felt like the 100th time. His voice was hoarse from lack of sleep and constant talking. "I didn't see anyone, and no one saw me." The detectives exchanged weary glances. They knew they had nothing solid, nothing that would hold up in court. After several more minutes of fruitless questioning, they finally relented. "You're free to go for now," one of the detectives said, his tone heavy with warning. "But don't leave town. You're still a suspect, and if we find anything that ties you to this, you'll be back here in cuffs, understand?" With that, he was released, stepping out into the early morning light with a heavy heart. The world outside seemed too different now, colder, more unforgiving. The first thing he did was make his way to the funeral home, where Alex's small, closed, empty casket awaited. Alex's body had been buried in the morning as he was a threat still, even after dying, to the merciless virus. The service was held for people he knew, friends he grew up with, played in the streets, the room filled with muted sobs and soft murmur of prayers. David stood at the back, his hands clenched into fists, his heart aching with grief and anger. When it was time to say his final goodbye, David approached the casket, placing a hand on the smooth, polished wood. The weight of his promise pressed down on him like a physical burden. "I'm so sorry, buddy," David said gently, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't save you, but I swear, I will get justice for you, and for all the innocent people who have been taken by this madness." He stepped back, but his mind was already turning, planning. It was time to act. It was time to arrange another meeting. After the service, as mourners filed out of the funeral home, David lingered, waiting for the right moment. He approached a short, bold man standing by the door, holding his cap in his hands. Someone he recognized formed the secretive meetings. Their eyes met, and a silent understanding passed between them. "Tomorrow night," David murmured, keeping his voice low. "We need to talk. It's time." The man nodded, his expression grim. "I'll let the others know. Same place?" David confirmed with a slight nod. "Same place." As he walked away, David felt a new sense of resolve harden within him. He had been pushed too far, lost too much. The people who had orchestrated this horror, who had murdered his nephew and countless others, they were going to pay. The battle was far from over, and David was ready to fight. This time, there would be no hesitation, no holding back. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. And as he disappeared into the cold, unforgiving night, David knew one thing for certain. He would not rest until justice was served. Chapter 6. The Inside Man. The secretive meeting was held outer skirts of the city, where industries once boomed. They chose an abandoned factory. The air in the building was thick with tension, the only sound the occasional creak of the wind rattling the rusted beams above. The dim light from the laptop cast long shadows over the group huddled around the broken workout table, their faces illuminated by the glow of the screen. On the laptop, the stark works burned into the darkness, motion to take control. Eliminate population. Keep everyone occupied. Spread virus among them. Jones scrolled through the encrypted data, his face set in frustration. "This is big," he muttered, his eyes darting back and forth as he examined the files. "But I can't crack the encryption. Whatever this is, it's locked down tight. I'd need access to their internal systems to get anything more from the world's largest research lab." "Actually," Jones replied, his fingers pausing on the keyboard. He glanced up at the others. "I've got a contact, my girlfriend's boyfriend. He works at the lab, but he's not exactly the kind of guy who would just hand over sensitive files like this. And the place is locked down tight, a 5-mile radius guarded by military personnel. No civilian is getting within 100 meters of that place without being shot." David stood at the edge of the group, his arms crossed, eyes narrowed in thought. He'd heard enough. This wasn't a time for caution or hesitation. If they were going to expose the truth, they had to take risks, big ones. "What's his name?" David asked, his voice steady but commanding. Jones looked at him, hesitating. "His name's Greg. But like I said, I don't know if I can convince him to get involved in something like this. He's not exactly the rebellious type." "You're going to have to try," David said, stepping forward, his gaze locked on Jones. "There's no way we're getting close to that lab without getting gunned down. You said it yourself, the encryption too tight. The only way we get the data is if someone on the inside brings it to us. Jones shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, man. Greg's not someone who takes risks. He's got a good job, a comfortable life. He's not going to throw that away just because I ask him to." "Then don't just ask him," Steve growled, his arms crossed over his broad chest. "Make him an offer. Everyone's got a price. Money, protection, hell, whatever he needs. We'll make it worth his while." David stepped closer to Jones, his voice dropping to a low, intense tone. "Look, I get that this is asking a lot, but we're not playing games anymore. They killed my nephew. They've killed countless people with this virus, and they're going to kill a lot more if we don't stop them. You need to convince Greg, no matter what it takes." Jones looked around at the group. Steve, lean but well-trained in the army. Rob, ex-militant, tall, overgrown beard and tattoo sleeve running across his left arm. Williams, a very large, tall man with a gold tooth and a tattoo on his neck. And finally, David, the handsome one. But today he looked tired, overgrown beard, circles under his eyes. They were all counting on him, on this one fragile thread of a connection to someone who could break the case wide open. He sighed, rubbing his face in frustration. "I'll try," Jones said at last, his voice uncertain. "But it's going to take more than just me. Greg's paranoid about stuff like this. He's worked for the government long enough to know the risks of getting caught." "Then give him something he can't refuse," Rob said, speaking up for the first time since arriving. His voice was quiet but firm, and his tall, lean frame seemed tense with unspoken resolve. "Whatever his concerns are, we'll find a way around them." Jones stared at the laptop screen again, the encrypted files taunting him with the answers they couldn't reach. Jones spoke. "He'll need more than money. He'll need assurance that he's not going to be thrown to the wolves if something goes wrong." David exchanged a glance with Steve and said, "We'll figure it out. We have contacts, people who can make sure Greg is safe if this blows up, but first, we need him on board. Set up a meeting with him. Let's see what we're dealing with." Jones hesitated for a long moment, clearly conflicted, but finally he nodded. "All right, I'll reach out to him. But this isn't going to be easy. I can't guarantee he'll go for it." "You don't have to guarantee anything," David said, his tone dark with determination. "Just give us the chance to talk to him." Steve leaned forward, his voice gruff but encouraging. "We'll be right behind you. You won't be alone in this." Jones shut the laptop, the flickering glow disappearing from the room and plunging them into near darkness. The sound of the wind outside picked up, a low, hollow moan that seemed to echo the gravity of the situation. "We don't have much time," Williams said, his sharp eyes glinting in the dim light. "If they suspect we're onto them, they'll shut everything down, and we'll never get another chance." David's thoughts were already racing ahead, planning their next move, considering every possible angle. He had lost too much already. Alex was gone, his family shattered, and the conspiracy that had taken everything from him still lurked in the shadows, ready to destroy more lives. He couldn't let it happen again. "We're running out of options," David said, his voice steely. "This is our best shot, and we need to be ready when the time comes. Jones, set up the meeting. We'll figure out the rest when we know what we're working with." Jones nodded again, though his reluctance was clear. "I'll call him tonight." The group disbanded quietly, each man retreating to his own thoughts as they slipped back into the darkness of the night. David lingered for a moment, staring out at the distant city lights, the weight of the promise he had made to his nephew pressing heavily on his shoulders. David clenched his fists, a fire of resolve burning in his chest. He wasn't just fighting for Alex now. He was fighting for every innocent life the virus had claimed, and for the countless more it would destroy if they didn't stop the people behind it. As David turned and walked back into the shadows, the wind howled through the abandoned building as if warning him of the dangerous path ahead. But he didn't care. He was ready. Chapter 7. The Secrets We Keep. The city was unrecognizable. The streets, once teeming with life and bustling with the everyday chaos of modern world, now felt like a war zone. Martial law had been declared after riots broke out across the cities next day. Hospital symbols of hope and recovery were now prime targets for enraged mobs. The virus, the unseen enemy, was everywhere. But it wasn't just the virus killing people. It was the fear, the violence, the desperation that had consumed the population within days. Buildings were burned and bodies littered the streets. The city David once knew had become a living nightmare. As he drove towards Jones's flat, David could feel weight of that nightmare pressing down on him. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel, navigating the empty streets where military checkpoints had popped up every few blocks. The presence of soldiers and tanks did little to comfort him. If anything, it reminded him how close the country was to total collapse. They had arranged the meeting with Greg at Jones's flat, the only safe place left in the city they could trust. But with martial law in place, even getting Greg there had been a challenge. They had moved through back streets, avoided major checkpoints, and relied on Jones's tech skills to disable a few cameras long enough for Greg to slip through unnoticed. It was a dangerous game, but the files were worth the risk. When David pulled up to Jones's small, nondescript apartment building, his eyes scanned the surrounding area for any signs of trouble. Satisfied that no one was watching, he stepped out of the car and hurried inside. Jones was pacing nervously in the living room, his eyes darting between the windows and the door as if expecting an ambush at any moment. Steve and Rob were already there, seated at the table with grim expressions. Williams stood in the corner, his arms crossed, watching as Greg sat across from them, calm but visibly tense. Greg was an unassuming large man, slightly hunched but tall, bold patches with dark circles under his eyes. He looked tired, like a man who hadn't slept in days, or maybe even weeks. But his eyes betrayed something more, a secret burden he carried, one that was eating away at him. David wasted no time as he entered. "Did you bring the files?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with urgency. Greg nodded, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a slim USB drive. He placed it on the table in front of them, staring at it for a moment before sliding it towards Jones. "Everything you need is on there," Greg said, his voice flat. "But before we go any further, I want to make sure we're clear on my terms." "We've discussed this already," Steve said, his heavy voice cutting through the tension. "You'll get your safe passage out of the country. You, your family, everything's been arranged, but you give us what we need first." Greg glanced at Steve, then to David, his pale grey eyes narrowing. "I don't care about money or protection. I just want to get out of here, with a new identity. I want to get my family away from this hell." His voice wavered slightly, the weight of his desperation apparent. "Once I give you these files, I'm done. I'm out. That's the deal." David, arms crossed, stepped forward and looked Greg in the eyes. "You're running away," he said, but his voice carried an edge of suspicion. "You're afraid. But you're not just afraid of the violence. What aren't you telling us, Greg? There's something else, isn't there?" The room fell silent as the others turned their attention to Greg, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His eyes flickered with a mix of guilt and fear. For a moment, he said nothing, the weight of David's question hanging in the air. "David," Jones started, but David cut him off, his focus still on Greg. "You're one of the scientists, aren't you?" David pressed. "One of the people responsible for this virus. That's why you want to run." Greg's face paled, and he looked down at the table, unable to meet David's eyes. "Yes," he finally admitted. "I was one of the 7 scientists involved in the project, but I didn't know what it would become. I didn't know it would be used on our own people. I was told it was to protect our country from threats, as bioweapon." David's pulse quickened. "Used like what?" he asked. "What's in those files, Greg?" Greg sighed, running a hand on his sweaty forehead, and replied, "You'll find everything in there. The project's full scope, the plans, everything. It's more than just the virus. It's a coordinated planned population control, destabilization, total domination, and to eventually rebuild the world with control. We were just pieces in their games." "You helped create this!" Steve growled, getting up, his fists clenched to hit Greg. Williams holds him down. "And now you want to run, after everything you have done!" "I didn't know," Greg snapped, his voice cracking. "We were told it was research for the better good, for our country's safety, for our people, when under threat, theoretical. But then they took it, twisted it. We had no idea how far they would go until it was too late. By then they had control. They were pulling the strings, and anyone who resisted disappeared." Rob, quiet until now, leaned forward and asked, "Why didn't you go public? Expose them before it got this far?" Greg laughed bitterly. "You think we didn't try? The minute we started asking questions, the people in charge made sure we were either silenced or reprogrammed. I saw colleagues vanish overnight. I couldn't take that risk. I had a family to protect." David grabs him by the neck with fist in air. Jones grabs his hand that was about to knock Greg out. So that's why you want out? Not just because of the virus or the violence, you piece of... You're afraid they'll come for you too. Greg nodded, his hands up to protect a blow from David's fists as he spoke. They've already started cleaning house. I'm lucky to be still here. But if I don't get out now, they won't just kill me. They'll kill everyone I care about. My daughter, same age as your nephew, Jones told me. The room fell silent again. David dropped in the sofa seat, pushing Jones of him, the weight of Greg's confession sinking in. David felt his heart pounding in his chest, the gravity of the situation pressing down on him. You're not proud of what you have created, David said softly, almost to himself. But you'll carry it with you until the day you die. Greg met his gaze, his expression haunted. It will haunt me forever, but I'm trying to make it right. This, he gestured to the USB drive, this is my chance to undo some of the damage. After this, I'm done. David glanced at Jones, who had already plugged the USB into the laptop, scanning the files as fast as he could. It's all here, Jones muttered, his voice tense with disbelief. My God, everything he said. Population control, virus strains. This country is just a trial. There's other countries involved in it, the military's involvement. They're trying to rebuild the world in their image. Controlled new world. This is a blueprint for disaster, David finished, his mind reeling. This is what they've been hiding. Greg stood, taking a deep breath as he gathered himself. You have what you need now. I've done my part. I just want to be with my family, get out of this country and never look back. David slides a large fat envelope towards him. Everything is in there, new identities, location to be picked up and shipped out. Greg picked up the envelope and held it close to his chest. He headed toward the door. Before leaving, he turned to them one last time. Good luck, he said, his voice full of forgiveness. You'll need it. And with that he was gone, disappearing into the night. As the door closed behind him, David stared at the USB drive on the table, the weight of its contents heavy on his mind. They had the truth now. A blueprint for the cure they had kept hidden, guarded, while people were dying, while Alex was fighting for his life. They had the truth now, but the fight was far from over. We have what we need, David said, his voice low and determined. But now, we need to figure out how to use it. And as sounds of sirens silenced, carrying with it the sounds of a world on the brink of collapse, David knew that their real battle was only just beginning. But how will they expose the truth? But how? Chapter 8. The Truth Must Be Told. David stood by the window of the cabin, staring out at the vast expanse of trees that stretched endlessly in every direction. The quiet of the wilderness was a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed the cities. He had brought his sister Claire to stay with their father in this off-grid cabin, far from the violence and madness that had engulfed the country. The others in his group, Steve, Rob, Williams and Jones, had done the same, ensuring their families were hidden and safe. Getting their families out of the city safely took them weeks. Now it was time to focus on the mission that had become their singular purpose, to expose the monsters behind the virus and the mass slaughter of innocents. Inside, the small group gathered around the table in the dim light of the cabin's single lamp. The table was littered with papers, maps and laptops. But the centerpiece of the room was the large wooden crate sitting on the floor, filled with thousands of USB drives, each loaded with the files they had copied from Greg's original drive. The horrifying truth of the government's plan for population control, the virus they had unleashed, and the cure sitting locked away in the biotech research Nexus lab. We've got the USBs, Steve said, his deep, generally voice cutting through the heavy silence. But now comes the hard part, getting them into the hands of the public. Jones, who had been hunched over his laptop, looked up. His face etched with tension spoke. They're monitoring everything. The internet, the news, social media. It's all locked down. Any mention of the virus being man-made or the cure, and it gets scrubbed immediately. We can't just upload this and expect it to spread. They'll kill it before it even reaches 10 people. David nodded grimly. They had known this from the beginning. The authorities had a strong hold on information, and any attempt to expose the truth had to be done outside the usual channels. The USB drives were their last resort, but how could they ensure the information would get out, spread far enough and fast enough that the government couldn't stop it? "We need to go old school," Williams said, his sharp eyes scanning the room. "Physical distribution. Hand these out directly to people. Once they're out in public, the government can't control who sees it." "But how do we do that without getting caught?" Rob asked, his arms crossed as he leaned back in his chair. "We can't exactly walk through the streets handing out USBs when there's martial law. They'll arrest us before we can distribute even a dozen." David tapped his fingers on the table, deep in thought. The plan was risky, but there was no other way. "We can't do it all by ourselves," he said slowly. "We need help, people who are willing to take the risk to spread the truth. This isn't just about us anymore. We need to create a network. We have contacts, people we can trust. We reach out to them, get them to distribute the drives across different cities. If we coordinate it right, we can overwhelm the system." Steve nodded in agreement. "We'll need to spread out, hit as many places at once as we can. Public squares, train stations, anywhere people are still gathering." "It's risky," Jones said, rubbing the back of his neck, "but it's the only way. We can't afford to hold back now." David stood, his resolve hardening, and spoke. "We've already risked everything to get this far. We can't stop now. The truth needs to come out, and it needs to happen fast." The group was silent for a moment, the weight of their decision sinking in. They all knew the risks. They could be caught, killed, or worse. But the stakes were too high to turn back now. "All right," David said, looking around at the group. "Here's how we do it." Chapter 9. The Plan. The plan came together over the next week. Using their contacts from the black market, old military friends and underground resistance networks, they reached out to trusted individuals across the country. They kept everything low-tech, communicating through burner phones and coded messages to avoid detection. Each person would receive a small shipment of USB drive with instructions to distribute them in public places where they would have the most impact. David's role was clear. He and the rest of the core group would lead the charge, each of them taking a different major city. They would personally deliver the first batch of drives to key contacts and ensure the operation kicked off without a hitch. From there, if all went according to plan. The night before the operation, they gathered one last time at the cabin. The atmosphere was tense but filled with a quiet determination. They knew this could be the last time they see each other. There was no guarantee they would all make it out alive. Steve, as usual, broke the silence. "You all know what to do. We hit them hard and fast. Once those drives are in the hands of the public, there's no turning back." Jones, always the practical one, added, "We have built a website hosted on offshore servers, encrypted to hell. The USB drives link to it, where all the files will be downloadable. Even if one person gets the files, they can spread them from there. It's about creating enough noise that the truth can't be ignored." David looked around the room, his heart heavy but resolute. "This is for everyone they've killed," he said quietly. "For Alex, for Claire, for all the people who've suffered because of their lies. We end this here." One by one they all nodded, their expressions set with the same fierce determination. The next morning, David found himself driving back towards the city, a crate of USB drives hidden in the trunk of his car. He was heading for the train station, one of the few places left where people still gathered in large numbers, even under the tight grip of martial law. As he parked the car a few blocks away and began the walk to the station, his heart raced. His mind flashed with thoughts of Claire, his father, and Alex. He could feel the weight of their expectations on him, the need to make this right. He couldn't fail them. He wouldn't. When he arrived at the station, he scanned the crowd. There was a heavy military presence, soldiers patrolling the platforms and watching for any signs of unrest. David kept his head down, moving swiftly through the throngs of people, slipping USB drives into bags, pockets, and anywhere they wouldn't be noticed until later. He wasn't the only one. His contact was already at work, quietly distributing the drives to anyone who looked like they might be sympathetic to the cause. The operation went smoothly, too smoothly. As David handed out the last of his drives, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He glanced around, his instincts kicking in. There were two men in civilian clothes watching him from the far end of the platform. They were too still, too focused. They weren't passengers. They were watching him. David's pulse quickened. He turned, walking briskly toward the exit, trying not to draw attention. But it was too late. The men were following him now, their pace quickening as they closed the distance. David ducked into an alley, his heart pounding as he heard footsteps behind him. He had to get out, had to disappear before they caught him. But as he rounded the corner, a hand grabbed his arm, yanking him back. David spun around, ready to fight, but the man holding him wasn't one of the pursuers. It was Steve. "Come on!" Steve growled, pulling him toward a side door. "We've got to move, now!" Together they slipped through the door and into the labyrinth of back streets, disappearing into the city's shadows. By the time they regrouped that night, the operation was already underway. Across the country, thousands of USB drives were in the hands of ordinary people, people who would see the truth, who would share it, who would spread it until it was impossible to suppress. The virus might have been created in secret, but the truth would be their downfall. David sat back, exhausted but relieved. The hardest part was over. Now, they just had to wait for the storm to come. And when it did, the world would finally know the truth. Chapter 10. The Price of Victory. The USB drives had spread like wildfire, unstoppable despite the government's desperate attempts. No matter how hard they tried shutting down websites, censoring the news, even arresting those caught distributing the drives, it was too late. The truth was out, the dam had broken, and the world finally knew the monstrous plan behind the virus. Across the globe, the files revealed the horrifying extent of the conspiracy, the deliberate spread of the virus, and most importantly, the hidden cure. Nations that had remained silent were now scrambling. Japan shipped their stockpiled cures, defying them, government's attempts to keep the antidote out of the public's hands. Greg's final file, the one he had passed to David and the others, had been the key. It contained the formula, the research, and the contact points for labs worldwide. The world would be able to fight back, but it came at a terrible cost. The cities were in ruins. Countless lives had been lost, not only to the virus, but to the violence that had erupted in its wake. Hospitals lay in ashes, burned by mobs who saw them as symbols of betrayal. Military forces had clamped down hard, but martial law could only do so much against a population that has seen through the lies. The virus had become airborne, spreading rapidly regardless of the controls in place, and though the cure was now available, it could not undo the devastation that had already been wrought. The boys, David, Steve, Rob, Jones and Williams, had done their part. They had risked everything to expose the truth, and now that truth was unstoppable. But their mission was over. There was nothing more they could do to save the cities, to rebuild the broken system. The fight had left them exhausted, shattered by loss and grief. They drove away from the city as the smoke rose from the skyline, heading toward the mountains, towards the cabins. They had agreed to meet here, where they had sent their families. It was their last refuge, far from violence and destruction, a place to mourn, to remember, to try and heal. When they arrived, the air was crisp and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind. The sun was setting, casting a soft orange glow over the snow-peak mountains. David parked his car beside the others and stepped out, his heart heavy with a mix of relief and sorrow. The others were already gathering around the fire pit, their faces drawn with exhaustion, fighting this battle for almost over a year, but they felt alive with a shared sense of bitter-sweet victory. Steve stood by the fire, stacking logs as it cracked and burned. Rob and Jones sat nearby, silent, staring into the flames. Williams had his arm around his young daughter, one of the few family members who had survived. David's sister Claire was there too. She looked thinner, paler, her eyes sad from the grief of losing Alex and James. When David approached, she gave him a weak smile, but the sadness never left her face. They had lost too much, so much death, so much pain. For a moment they stood in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a bottle of whiskey, settling it down on the edge of the fire pit. One by one they filled their glasses, the weight of their shared experience binding them in a way words never could. David raised his glass, his throat tight, as he looked at the faces of his friends, those who had fought alongside him, who had lost just as much as he did. His thoughts drifted to Alex, the sweet boy who had meant everything to him, whose life had been cut short by this madness. "Justice hasn't been fully served," David began, his voice rough with emotion, "but we stopped something far worse from happening. We prevented a disaster for humanity." His gaze dropping to the fire, the flames dancing in his eyes. The group was silent for a moment, each of them lost in their own thoughts, their own memories of the loved ones they had lost. "To all of them," Steve said, his voice gruff but filled with emotion. "To everyone we've lost along the way. raising his glass. Claire wiped a tear from her cheek, her hand trembling as she raised her glass. They clinked their glasses together and left one by one, leaving David standing there alone for a very long time. Despite the harsh mountain winter, the sky was clear, and when David finally looked up, he saw stars twinkling in the sky, bright and distant. It was a quiet reminder that, despite everything, life went on. They had fought for a future that Alex and so many others would never see. But they had given the world a chance to rebuild, to recover from darkness that had almost consumed it. The world was scared, but it would heal, eventually. And with that thought, David raised his glass towards the sky one final time and says in a low voice, "I kept my promise. Rest in peace, Alex. We did it." The end.